Grüß, willkommen in einer Video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case episode 16 of my Wargaming Rules Review series of videos. In this video I'll cover an older set of Napoleonic rules, Garde which were first published in 1983, followed by Garde 2 in 1989, and then Garde 3 in 2004. I must admit, when I researched these rules, I was a bit confused about the version numbering, but according to the designer's notes, the first edition, published in 1983, was the gold cover version, which is shown on the left, which was self-published by Rudy Scott Nelson. The next version, which came out in 1989 to 1990, was published by Xeno Games and was called the Red Box edition, shown on the right. When I went through the notes of version 3, the designer of the rules did not seem to be very happy with the second edition, as he felt the rules were not adequately proofread. Apparently an incorrect image was included into the rules, which I have to assume it means maybe it has other errors. I'm uncertain. On the other hand, in my discussion with the designer on the temp site, other players of the rules suggested the second edition was the best edition for me to learn the rules. I'm uncertain what the issues or differences were, but as I was unable to obtain a copy of the first or second edition rules, I'll never probably find out. The third edition came out in 2004 and was only available as a PDF or Word document from the deepfriedmice.com site. This video is based on the third edition, as these are the only version of the rules I could obtain a copy of. Before we drill down into the rules themselves, a quick overview of the rules. The Garde Corps scale was very similar to Empire 3rd edition or even the old WRG rules from the UK. The rules themselves were influenced, apparently, by Empire 3rd edition, and initially it used the Empire 3rd edition basing system. By version 3, it had generally adopted a standard 4cm wide element basing system, although the players I contacted in the US were using the US style of basing, where each 15mm figure, or base, was 2 centimeters wide by 3 centimeters deep, or in imperial measures, 3/4 inch wide by 1 inch deep. The army lists by themselves are worth to download these rules if you're interested. Even if you're not interested in playing the game, army lists are pretty good. While this scale does not interest me these days that much, I did give these rules a good solid investigation, as I think they offer something unique. Even if I never play the rules, which actually I did play the rules, the army lists will be useful in creating army lists for other rules. The reason why, even though I earlier said I was not interested in this game, but the reason why I've gone back to look at these rules was to pursue an idea that I have, which is you can take older rules, which are no longer played, and refresh them to make them more attractive to new players. This involves removing game systems which are not commonly used and replacing them with the latest equivalent, which are more popular. Coupled with this is to convert all measurements into base widths and implement any suitable quick play game systems in an effort to speed up gameplay and simplify gameplay. The main components of the rules, or older rules, need to be kept, and this is typically the scale and combat system. I initially tried this idea using the old WRG Napoleonic rules, and the results actually ended up being very good. Gameplay was dramatically sped up. The rules were restructured and cross-referenced so they could be used as a reference document during the game, which also helped gameplay. One result of this sped-up version of the WRG Napoleonic system was that I fully realized what the true objective of the original rules were, which was competition play. WRG does a good job reproducing about 15 minutes of an actual battle, with game turn durations of 90 to 180 seconds and game lengths of 12 game turns. You end up with around about 15, maybe a bit more, minutes of actual action, or at least you'll be simulating that. For competition games, this worked brilliantly, but if you wanted to reproduce a historical battle, they were less than ideal. After this experiment, I wanted to try another set of rules. I had an interest in battalion scale rules because I did a bit of an analysis of, columns in attack and the way they form, the way the battalions were organized, and I was interested to see if rules could actually duplicate this. Now, in order to achieve this, I needed to find another set of rules which use the same ground scale as the WRG rules. Now, I flipped through a number of rules. In the end, I settled on Garde. I have to admit, learning these rules from the downloadable PDF file was hard, really hard. It was so hard I almost gave up, but after getting some assistance from the designer, I doubled down and began to forensically analyze the rules. This was not an easy task, and if I had not already done a similar process with the WRG rules, I would have probably not completed this project. But eventually a reformatted version of the rules were developed. I added a lot of cross-referencing, and I mean a lot of cross-referencing and duplication of various rules in their appropriate position within the rules, and the result was that I ended up with a document I could start to create example of gameplays with. I attempted to duplicate as many game operations a player would be expected to complete in a typical game, and then created a detailed example of each of those operations. Once I had that sorted, I then created a detailed examples document which showed gameplay in a diagrammatical format. I have no doubt I have not covered everything a player would expect to face in the game, as I simply ran out of steam, but I feel I covered the most important gameplay examples. The next stage was game aids. To make these rules playable, you needed to be able to use a single cheat sheet which contained everything you needed to play a game. Yeah, sure, you may have to reference a set of rules sometimes when you have to try and work out how this worked or whatever worked, but for normal gameplay operations, all you should be using is a single A4 cheat sheet. The result was a single A4 sheet, example shown here, which can be printed double-sided and then used as a cheat sheet. I normally use thick or 200 GSM paper and then cover it with clear plastic contact to give me something that actually looks pretty good, and it works very well. The other game aids I needed to create was a turn record chart, which I originally set at 16 game turns, shown here, but I now feel 12 game turn is about all you could play in a solid 8-hour gaming session before you dropped from exhaustion. Other game aids were the reserve zone sheet, shown on the right, and anything else which eliminated the need for record keeping. I then created counters, lots and lots of counters, order counters on the left and standard game counters on the right. I have also created ammunition counters, which are not shown here. This represents a lot of counters, but record keeping, that is with a pen and paper, slows down a game, and replacing that activity with counters does help to speed up gameplay. All this activity and work allowed me to run a couple of test games. A quick caveat. I may have made some errors in my interpretation. I did receive some assistance from the designer, which helped greatly, but I could not ask him the hundreds of questions a day I needed answered. So I had to rely on carefully reading the rules and interpreting them the best as I could. That's the development of what I've done, playtesting rules. Now, before I go into the actual game system, I just wanted to provide a quick 10,000 metre view of the rules, based on my personal opinion. These rules are very detailed and complex, as well as attempting to focus on historical accuracy. As these came from Empire 3rd Edition heritage, this makes a lot of sense. I also suspect this was a reaction to the competition play focus of many other rules around at the time, such as, for example, WRG. The rules have clearly developed organically and after a lot of playtesting. It's clear a lot of effort went into these rules, but the result is the rules themselves have related rules scattered throughout the rules book, making them difficult to reference. This is not uncommon, no particular criticism, and even more modern rules such as DBM are exactly the same. If I compare these with Empire 3rd Edition, I'd say these rules are better, but only slightly better than the way that the Empire 3rd Edition rules are structured. The complexity and the way the rules are structured, it was very common of rules in the 1980s. Rules such as Corps Commander were equally complex. It was simply the main focus in the 1980s. If you could divide rules into high-level groups, then you could say prior to the 1980s, the focus was competition play. In the 1980s to 90s, maybe even early 2000s, the focus moved to historical accuracy, complexity and detail. Since the 2000s, or maybe a bit later, the focus has moved to playability and higher-level scale games. There are obviously exceptions to this general flow, but this is what I feel the evolution of pretty much all figure gaming rules seem to have followed. I've skipped the skirmish thing, but the skirmish rules really fits into the playability bucket, which could be an explanation for why they're so incredibly popular these days. They're simple to play. Let's now go into the rules. Now, I was originally going to go through the sequence of play sequentially, but there are some themes or game system themes which span phases. So let's look at the first most significant aspect of the rules, which is movement is simultaneous. I found this a bit of a surprise, as simultaneous movement systems have seemed to have gone out of fashion by the 1980s for many good reasons. I have to admit, a lot of effort has gone into reducing the issues with simultaneous movement in Garde, and I must admit the results are certainly playable. The first game mechanic system that was implemented to overcome many of the issues with simultaneous movement was order chits. During the command phase, players place order chits face down next to all the units. A typical game of 2 divisions each would give each player about 20-30 units each. Not every unit needed an order chit, but most of the units which were going to do any formation or facing changes generally did. Examples of the orders are assume line with no direction change, assume column and face about, anywhere between 91 and 180 degrees, form square, change to skirmish status, etc. Basically, each player secretly determines what each unit will be doing in a sort of a high-level general manner, and mainly related to formation facing changes, but charging and movement also is applied. The chit idea allowed players to avoid writing anything down, such as orders, which is a major turn-off for most players these days. Once all the chits were deployed during the following phase, most of the formation-facing changes were executed. This is done simultaneously, and as there is no actual charges or movement occurring, this could be completed rather quickly. This sets up the game turn, and players who've made the wrong decisions will suffer as a result. I'll skip the artillery phase for now and move to charges because I want to stay on the simultaneous movement theme. The next movement-related phase is the charge phase or charge declaration phase. During this phase, any charge orders are disclosed and they're executed simultaneously. By limiting this phase to only charges, it is easier to deal with simultaneous movement, or charging in this case. There were a lot of rules which covered counter charges and other game functions, which could be difficult to execute when conducted simultaneously. But the biggest issue with simultaneous movement was quarantined to a low number of units. In most cases, players would not simultaneously charge each other, and as a result, there would be no issues. So for most of the game turns, I went through the charge declaration phase fairly quickly. It was only a couple of times where there were cavalry charges that were towards each other that was a little bit of complexity, and you had to drill down into the rules to try and work out what you needed to do in those cases. Now, let's end with our movement, and that occurs in the appropriately named movement phase. All other units now move. As no units will be contacting each other, the simultaneous nature of this phase is not really a major issue, with the specific order of movement dealing with most of the major issues. I'm not a fan of simultaneous movement, but I have to admit the order chits, the sequence of play, and the supporting rules do a good job of reducing the biggest issues with simultaneous movement, which is arguments between players. Doesn't entirely eliminate it, but it eliminates a good, solid percentage of it. There are other rules which also minimize the gamey aspect of simultaneous movement, such as the ability to make charges or to charge in the flank, thus limiting the ability of a plan to, or the ability to play a duck and weave of your cavalry just to touch the flank corner of a unit in a really weird way, which is quite common, or was quite common, with older simultaneous movement game systems, particularly back in the WRG Ancients era. That covers movement. Now let's look at the artillery fire phase. So we'll have to go back up for that. Artillery fires in two phases during the game. If the artillery moves, its ability to fire is restricted, but once the artillery is in place, they can fire away twice a game turn. The most interesting rule I came across was the ammunition rule, which limited the ability of artillery to constantly fire away like a machine gun at anything even vaguely in range. I'm not actually certain how many rounds per guns the rules recommend or allow, because in my copy of the rules, this is not stated anyway. But a gun normally had about 200-300 rounds for a battle, which allowed it to fire away for 2 solid hours before running out of ammunition. As each game turns represents about 15 minutes, that represents about 8 game turns. I decided on a figure of 8 rounds per gun. In the rules, you are supposed to keep track of each battery, that is ammo of each battery, but for simplicity I simply have a pool of ammunition for all the guns in the playing area. Each time a new gun arrives, I add 2 additional rounds. Now normally a whole battery would arrive of 4 elements, so you have to basically provide 32 rounds of ammo, but I think you get what I'm trying to get to. Once again, I have to admit I don't like ammunition rules normally, but after playing WRG I totally understand why it's important. Guns had a limited number or amount of ammunition, and low probability firing was not encouraged. Even counter-battery fire was rare in the period. When using WRG, counter-battery fire at long range was always conducted, which rarely occurred historically, and this must be due to ammunition constraints. This simple rule really had a major effect on artillery usage, much greater than I ever really imagined. Players only used artillery if there was a point to using it, and if the expectation was the effect would be significant. After the movement phase was executed, you get a second round of artillery fire. Horse artillery would find this phase rather useful, as they could move into position during the movement phase and then could fire away during this phase. Let's now look at how artillery firing is conducted. The first point to note is these rules are unit-centric, not element-centric. If you fire artillery as a unit, so a typical battery consists of 4 elements of 2 guns each. A really big battery, shown on the top here, consists of 12 guns, but this is generally fairly rare, unless you're Russian. Each battery has an artillery effectiveness value, which players have to calculate. I have to admit here, this was yet another idea I did not initially like, but now think is rather clever. The downside is each player has to calculate their battery AEV value. The second downside is each time a gun is lost, this has to be recalculated. I originally felt this was simply too cumbersome, but after a few games, I have changed my mind. After setting up a game, or having a few games, I realised the number of batteries that you would normally field is not particularly large. A typical game consists of 2 to 3 divisions, one of which would likely be a small cavalry division or a brigade. A typical division did not contain a lot of guns. In this example, each French division gets only 1 battery, so we only need to deal with 2 or perhaps 3 batteries. The second thing I realised, particularly when I developed my quick play version of these rules, was that I could create a simple chart, shown here, which gave me whatever AEV value I needed for whatever nationality, gun type and battery strength. So a typical 6-pounder battery, French, had an AEV of 6. So if I lost a gun, this would remain 6, and if I lost an entire element, this would drop to 5. I have to cross-reference stuff, but the problem was comparatively minor. Remember, I've only got about 3 batteries of guns. I think the biggest force I ever fielded was 4 batteries. Now let's look at the artillery firing table, which also concerned me when I first saw it. Once again, I'm not a fan of percentage dice. There's a lot of things here I was not a fan of when I first viewed it, but afterwards I changed my mind. Now, you can replace this with a 20-sided dice, but I got over this minor issue pretty quickly and used percentage dice fairly quickly. I used to play rules back in the day that used percentage dice, so I'm used to it. It's just I don't particularly like it. Anyway, back to the table. This table does look reasonably complex, but after using it a few times, it's actually comparatively simple to use, because the modifiers, which normally is the complexity, you don't tend to use them very often. Let's now look at a firing example. A Russian 12-pounder Garde battery has an AEV of 8, which means with no modification, its BIR is 8. I don't even know what BIR stands for, bombardment something. But anyway, its attack value is 8. The target is an infantry column with a skirmish scheme, which means it gets a -1 modifier, which is applied, reducing your BIR to 7. The range is 400 yards, which means a hit will occur on a die roll of 70% or less. The target unit now needs to take a morale test if it suffers a casualty. Let's move to the other type of shooting, musket shooting. This is the main game for these rules. You win or lose by the use of musketry fire or volley fire. At least that's what the designer told me, and I have no reason to doubt him. When I looked at the musketry file table, it did look a lot like the artillery table. Let's first go to my initial issue, which is that we get another table. I prefer systems where you can just use a single table for all shooting, but putting that to one side, as long as you can fit all these tables on a cheat sheet, it's not an issue. Let's first look at the firepower values, which is highlighted in the red bar. In very simple terms, one figure equals one firepower point. All firing is done by units, not elements, so a 3-element line infantry unit has a firepower of 12, a 4-element unit has a firepower of 16, and they may not be much point going larger, but a 5-element unit has a firepower of 18 plus. While I'm not 100% certain of this, if the unit suffers casualties, such as 2 hits, the total number of firepower would be reduced by 2. So if my 5-element unit had suffered 2 hits, it would then remain at 18 firepower points. At least that's the way I played the rules. The firepower value is then modified by a training modifier. This is based on a unit's numeric grade, which I think is the melee grade. Each unit has an MMG value, such as C5. The C refers to morale grade, and I think the numeric number refers to melee grade or training. If our unit has an MMG of C5, then it would gain a +1 firepower, or FP. So if our 3-element unit had an FP of 12, it would then go up to 13 if its MMG was C3, or C5. Now, let's see if there are any other further firepower modifiers. The most common modifier is the did not move this turn, which means our 3-element unit can add 4 firepowers, FPs, to its total. The second most common is the target is formed line. Originally, I thought this was an error. Why would it be easier to hit formed line? However, I suppose formed line is a bigger target than, let's say, a column, so maybe it makes some sense. We will see later how this works in our example, and it seems to work. However, let's say there is no more further modifiers, and we end up with a firepower of 13. Let's now determine our musketry percentage for a hit. If we cross-reference an FP of 13 with the 0 to 150 yard column, we get a number which is 280, or it's actually 280%. This means there are 2 hits and an 80% chance of a third hit. This is a bloody system. There is a lot of casualties. If this was ranged fire between 151 to 250 yards, the result would be 110, which means 1 hit and a 10% chance of a second hit. I don't think units firing away at each other would last particularly long using this kind of bloody CRT. Let's now look at a specific example, primarily column versus line. A French musketeer unit in column and with an MMG of C5 is conducting musket fire against an Austrian musketeer unit in formed line. Because the French unit is in column, only the front element can fire. The French element has 4 figures and its training modifier gives it a firepower rating of 5. The target is in formed line, so the final musketry value is 7. The fire combat is a firefight, so the result is 160, or 1 hit and a 60% chance of a second hit. The Austrian unit will now need to take a morale test because at least 1 hit was going to be suffered. The Austrian unit, which is also C5, the MMG is C5, now fires back. With 3 elements and 4 figures per casting, its firepower rating is 12. This rises to 13 because of its training modifier. The result is 280, which means 2 hits and an 80% chance of a third hit. The French unit will need to take a morale test. We can see in this example the Austrian line has a significant advantage. The French need to form line or charge pretty quickly. Let's now look at another interesting aspect of the rules, which is skirmish fire. I can see how this rule originated from Empire 3rd edition, but the execution here, in my opinion, is a lot better than the 3rd edition execution, which is extraordinarily complex. Skirmish units can fire in groups of 4 elements, so a unit of 8 elements, which probably is, it's possible, could target 2 enemy units, and probably would because it would be that wide. Skirmish fire also has a different effect. Instead of mainly inflicting casualties, it causes morale tests with negative modifiers, and a little bit of casualties, not much. Let's look at this row, which is 10 FPs, which represents a lot of skirmishes. Perhaps 8 elements with a +1 because of their training grade and a +1 because they're skirmishes. The result is an MC result, or morale check, with a -5 modifier when you take the morale check. In addition, there is 1 kill or hit also inflicted. This does a nice job representing skirmishes. Because the unit suffered a loss and has to take a morale test, let's drill back and look at morale testing. Morale tests can be required if a unit suffers casualties to any form of shooting, musketry, skirmish, or alternatively artillery. Other causes of a morale test are if friendly units retreat disrupted, rout or break through a unit. So when units start breaking in melee, you can often get a cascading effect. If we look at our Austrian unit example, which is a C5 unit, which means there is a 15% chance of it failing a test. In this case, there are no modifiers, so in most cases this unit will pass the test. But let's see what happens when it fails. Now, I have to be honest, and I'm not 100% certain if this rule is the way I've interpreted it. That is, do you spin again on the morale failure result chart, or do you use the previous die roll? Let's see what happens if you use the same die roll. From our previous example, you had to spin under 15% for a failure. So let's say we spun 10%. This causes the Austrian unit to pretty much fail automatically. If I use the same die roll, the unit will rout big time. So I don't think this is the way the rule's meant to be played. Now, I have to admit, failure is a low probability event, so maybe it's not an issue, maybe that's the way it was intended, but I do suspect you have to spin your percentage dice again, and that tells you the result. Let's now look at melee, which in many ways ended up being the most complex aspect of the rules. I must admit I had a lot of issues working out what happens after a melee, especially with cavalry, so I hope I got it right. The first point is when units charge into contact, in some cases they can continue, that is, they can flow around their target and contact a new unit. Cavalry which charges a square can flow around if it's in line. Or if they do melee, that is, it's in column, has to melee, and they get an engaged result, they can then ignore the engaged result and then continue to flow around the square, initiating a second melee behind the square. Cavalry which can pursue can also continue their move and initiate a second melee. This is not a simple process, but it does mainly impact cavalry. As most historical games at this scale will be infantry affairs, this may not be a major issue, as, you know, from my... Okay, if you're using historical divisions, unless you're fielding a cavalry brigade or a division, you're not going to have much cavalry. Let's now look at the melee sequence. Now, I'm not going to follow the melee sequence as depicted in the rules exactly, as there is a lot of jumping around. But in simple terms, really one of the earliest things you need to do is determine who is the attacker and who's the defender. In most cases, the charger is the attacker, but there are some cases where this is reversed. I'm not going to cover those exceptions here. Let's keep it simple. Once we have determined an attacker and defender, we cross-reference the basic percentage of victory-loss. If the attacker has a melee grade of 6 and the defender has a melee grade of 5, the percentage is 60%. This is the chance the attacker will win. So the melee grade is very important. Let's now look at the modifiers. Because this is a first melee due to a charge, we'll use the assault values. If it was a second melee due to an engaged result, you use the engaged values. So let's look at the assault values. In most cases, none of these modifiers will typically be used. If you're using a modifier, you're normally doing a really stupid attack, or more likely, the other side is beginning to crumble and you're moving your troops in to finish them off. The second set of modifiers you need to look at are what's called the FPF modifier, or final protective fire modifier. If charging infantry, formed infantry, the defending infantry can conduct final protective fire against the charges. The FPF chart is on the right. If the defender is C5, it will get a +1 for its training grade. If the defender is in line, it gets a +6, otherwise +2 if in column. Assuming +6, this means the 60% that the charger needed to win is reduced by 7, and it becomes now 53%. It's not a big impact, but it is an impact. Now let's look at the situation modifier. The attacker is a column charging a line, which means it gets a +10 when we cross-reference. You can see with the red bars there. The percentage has now gone up to 67% for the attacker to win. We now spin our percentage die, and if the attacker gets 67% or less, it wins. Otherwise, it loses. Assuming our column has won the melee, let's see what happens. The winning unit has a value of C6, which means it uses the 6, 7, 8 column. If it spins a 50%, let's say it spins a 50%. Now we have to modify that die roll to see what the real result will be. In this case, there are no modifiers which apply, so let's move on. We've spun a 50. This is the value you need to look at under the 6, 7, 8 column. There is a value 40 to 59. 50 fits into that, so that's our row. If you move to the right, you'll see the result. Now, what we see here is the loser becomes unorganized and retreats 300 yards. It also suffers 1 hit. The winner stays halted and suffers only 1 hit. So it's not a massive victory, but it's certainly a victory. I'm not going to drill down into the rules any further because there's still quite a bit to drill down, but some observations I wish to make before I finish up the video. The rules do seem rather complex with a lot of charts and tables to consult. However, I found in practice, because it's unit-centric, not element-centric, this was not as big an issue as I originally thought it would be. A typical force mix consists of about 30 units. If we take a few game turns to get into contact, and when in contact most activity is musketry fire, assume that's the sort of game you're having, when a unit wavers, you then charge in, which can take 4 game turns of musketry firing in that case. Perhaps by game turn 6, which I think now is probably the midpoint of any game, each player has probably conducted about 60 to 80 musket firing die rolls. Now, this is not a trivial effort, but it is viable. Melee is and that's also the highest possible number, so you're really going right in. Melee is the most complex and time-consuming aspect of the rules. However, this is normally conducted when enemy units waver, and normally only a few melees occur in a game. Perhaps no more than 10, maybe 20 in an extreme case. However, look, while the unit-centric nature of the rules does give you significant advantages compared with, let's say, WRG, which is element-centric, these rules are nonetheless a complex set of rules, and shooting a melee will strain your brain if undertaken too much. This is why 12 game turns is about the most you can hope to complete after 8 hours of gaming. 8 game turns is probably more common because an old fellow like me then probably would feel like a nap after about 8 game turns. I also have to say I was rather impressed with the rules. They do contain a lot of interesting ideas and game systems, which I ended up liking. But if all you have is the downloaded copy of the rules, you will find it really, really hard to learn them without someone assisting you. My cross-referenced version and examples document will assist you significantly. But it's not a trivial effort to learn these rules, even with that particular assistance. These rules clearly come from an era where someone who knows the rules has to teach them to you. This works fine if you find players using the rules, but I have to admit never finding anyone around the world that I've been, at least, ever playing these rules. Now, after I finished this process, I did then go back and modify the rules for quick play purposes, and that did dramatically speed up play and make it a lot easier. But I did not touch the combat system as I felt that worked really well. So even with my quick play rules, these are not rules for a casual game with random players that don't really know much about the rules. Effort and planning is required to make a game work. I'm now in the process of conducting playtest sessions for my quick play version of the rules, and if it works out, I will create some videos on them. If they fail, then maybe I won't create any videos and finish up with this one. For those interested, I neglected to take any pictures of my Garde games. The pictures in this video comes from a game of WRG using my WRG quick play version of the rules. And so this concludes episode 16 of my video series on game rules review, or on game system reviews. In this case, providing an in-depth view of Garde 3, alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.